Okay, so now I'd like to introduce today's session. It is titled the Berkeley Online Advising, Student Data and Learning Analytics as a Service. Our presenters are Stephen Williams and Flint Hahn from the Department of Research, Teaching and Learning. So take it away, Stephen and Flint, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I see some familiar names attending today as well from the advising community. So I think there's going to be a little bit of us telling you about yourselves today. And so hopefully getting some sense of how you all fit into BOA as a service and how you fit into the bigger picture of the history and the goals and outcomes of what we've been able to accomplish with BOA over the last year and a half and the project history before that. And there we go. So I just wanted to give a quick outline of what exactly Flint and I will be covering today. First, I'm just going to give you some really brief overview of the Programming, Design, and Operations, also known as PDO team, which is part of Research, Teaching, and Learning, which is our larger department. How we operate, how we approach solving problems in the way that BOA solves problems for our campus. Flint will go into some detail on the project history and the partnerships that have really supported the success of BOA. I'll take everyone through a demo of the platform itself. I think some of you are pretty familiar with it because you're using it on a regular basis. And then I'll give a sort of more high-level overview a bit about the BOA outcomes so far at the campus level, and then some of our goals or aspirations with BOA. This is really a story about taking just the tremendous amounts of data that are being generated by all the different systems that everyone on campus is using all the time, and really thinking about how we can sort of strategically repackage and present that data to the advising community in a way that helps advise and help students success and accomplish the outcomes that they've really set out to achieve in their time at Berkeley. And I'm going to start just sort of with some of the conclusions in a way about the really key things that are I think the themes that I know I reflect on when I think about the work that's happened with BOA. The biggest piece is flexibility and adaptability. As Flint takes us through the project history, you'll see that we have had to sort of refine our goals and refine sort of our deliverables. And so our ability to do that, as well as to work with lots of different kinds of data from lots of different sources has been really critical to the success of this project. This is a project that's really characterized by its partnerships and its partners. BOA is great, the tools are great, but they're only great if people use them, and they're only great when they're making an impact. And we really feel that we've done that, and we'll tell you more about how we've done that. As we think about the assessment side, one of the things I want to share today, especially for those of you who don't work with BOA that much, is the sort of principle behind different ways that learning analytics get approached. And I really want to sort of start just by breaking out these ideas of descriptive analytics, where we are presenting the data with some visualizations, with some tools to help users work with that data. And that's work that we're doing today in BOA and putting in front of people. What we're not doing so much of at the moment is the predictive analytics, which you may hear a lot about from vendors. You may hear something about that from other universities as well. And this is sort of these, what I consider more aspirational tools that sort of take the data, crunch the numbers in an algorithm, and sort of make assessments about students, make assessments about different kinds of potential outcomes. We're not doing that with BOA, but we do think that the work that we've done with BOA does give us a foundation where, as those models, as those tools evolve and mature, that we've got a pretty solid sort of technical infrastructure through BOA, as well as a service infrastructure through BOA that will allow us to deliver those kinds of insights in the future when we have more confidence in those. And then the Canvas data, Canvas is bCourses. I just really want to emphasize with this descriptive analytics piece that advisors generally weren't in bCourses directly. And so we feel like with BOA, we've found a way to make that data valuable and really unlock the value of the data for the advisors in a way that provides a foundation for what we're doing in BOA. And I'll show you all this as we move on. So just a quick overview of PDO, the BOA team. This graph points to 2850 Telegraph, where of course none of us have been for a few months now, but normally we're housed down there with some of our IT partners. And so you may hear me talk today, Flint, talk about the Boa team. And so I just wanted to sort of briefly outline the composition of who that includes. Flint being the user experience designer, myself being the service lead and product manager, and then the other folks in this list being our more sort of technical staff. But the Boa team is also the bCourses team. They're also the course capture team. PDO has a pretty large portfolio of different educational technology tools. And then we also are working in partnership with Research IT as part of our department to support and enhance the tools that they offer there. So we have a really skilled team that's very sophisticated in their understanding and ability to work with university data, with learning data, and that expertise comes in large part from the fact that they're responsible for the technical implementation of a pretty wide range of tools. We use something called Agile Methodology, and so for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with the sort of software development side of things, this is a way that we work that not every information technology group works, where we're working on pretty short cycles, and we're working in a way that's very, very iterative and very much driven by our users, in this case the advisors, their feedback and their needs. So there's other ways of working where people gather a bunch of requirements up front, go off and work for 6 months, and then come back and say, here's what we did. We don't work so much in that way within PDO. This Agile methodology means that we're working in what's called sprints, which are now 2-week development cycles. So pretty quickly, every 2 weeks, we check in as a team, we set goals, we revisit the goals we set from the last cycle. And it's not to say we start over each time exactly, but we're definitely in this really continuous process of working together. And then there's also within Agile a real unique role, I think, that Flint and I play in terms of this continuous engagement with our users. And so this is something where Flint and I are listening to the advising community. We engage with advisors in a number of venues, and then we work together to sort of set the priorities and to roadmap the product of Boa for the developers. So they ultimately understand sort of the value of the work, and that they're using our expertise in hearing from all of you in the advising community about what users actually need. So I'm going to pivot briefly just into a quick overview of bCourses at Berkeley, and this may be very hard to read on your screen. You don't need to read all these numbers. I promise there won't be a test or anything at the end. But I really just put this graphic up here to show you the scale of what's happening in bCourses. And bCourses is our local brand for the Canvas learning management system, so you may hear me say those two terms interchangeably today. And this just is some visualizations that show different tools within bCourses and the tremendous volume of activity that happens in bCourses. So, you know, these are just page views of different tools. So, you know, we have, you know, each term, these peak terms especially, and this is, these big peaks happen not coincidentally in spring and fall 2020, when everything's been remote and when Canvas has been more critical than ever to the campus. But even prior to that, you can see, you know, our average, you know, file usage in pre-COVID times was maybe 10 million views of files per term. Now we're up to about 16 million. And actually keep in mind these fall numbers, of course, this is a term in progress. So this light blue bar in all of these fields is going to really, I think, eclipse all the others pretty substantially by the time we get to December and the fall term has concluded. So Canvas is being used I can't overstate how much Canvas gets used in this current situation. But even before we're in a fully remote world of instruction, Canvas was already getting millions of views. You know, pretty much every undergraduate, you know, 95% of courses were using Canvas in some capacity. And again, even before remote instruction, and currently it's essentially 100%. So Canvas as the foundation for our data gives us a very, very rich and robust set of data to work with. And Canvas itself has proven to be really good partners as well to get this data from. Canvas is a company that really sees the strategic value of data, and so it really simplifies our ability to work with the data. As the Canvas administrators, they make a tool available to us that they just call Canvas Data, pretty easy name. And they give us a few ways in a very automated sort of process to pull the data out of Canvas, to bring that into our own databases on a nightly basis, and to be constantly refreshing. So it really expedited the work for us quite a bit, because we didn't have to ask ourselves as many hard questions as we do with other tools about how will we get this data? Will it be in a format that we can understand and work well with? This is something where the partnership with Canvas has been so key to our ability to capture this data and to work with this data. And we continue to be engaged with Canvas on improvements to their platform and ways that we can get the data on a more even frequent cycle. We're currently refreshing the data from Canvas just on a nightly basis. That's working okay to meet our needs. But in 2021, we're hoping to move to a cycle where the Canvas data gets refreshed multiple times a day, and that'll be enabled by some technical work that Canvas themselves are doing that will allow us to get that new data on a more frequent cycle. We've got the Canvas data tool. Canvas also makes a number of APIs available that let us, the Canvas data is pretty comprehensive, but then the APIs let us do a little bit of an even deeper dive into some of the tools within Canvas that we're capturing data from. So now I'm going to hand it over to Flint to talk a little bit more about the project history and partnerships.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so the Boa journey has been long. And it's a fascinating kind of buildup of where things have been on campus and how we got to where we are today. A lot of services are built out of need, and there were a lot of servers and little FileMaker Pro databases underneath desks and whatnot, but it culminated in this idea of what's out there. What was the assessment of what services are available out there? In 2012, there was a strategic decision to kind of take a snapshot of what was available. There discovered a lot of older systems that may have required a little bit of effort, that having connection to these systems was not always possible for everyone involved, but there was also some security issues in some of these systems as well. There's also the maintenance cost of having these things. So taking a look of what was there and trying to figure out how we could integrate all of these systems into one collective cohesive system. And in doing so, the student information system came about of taking a look at what was there and how we can kind of synthesize and collect all of this information. If you have 2 bits of information where you're going to have 2 different student records, well, who's the record of authority in this? And so using that Oracle PeopleSoft Campus Solutions was a huge stride in trying to consolidate all that information into one collective area. And then the last point is taking a look at how this information can be shared. Who has access? Who needs to see what needs to be saw. Let's go to the next slide, Stephen. So again, the details on this aren't exactly important, but this is what we found, is that there was a lot of systems. Some talked to each other, some didn't, some we had no idea who they were, and it was a lot. It was a lot of information, and the information provided wasn't necessarily in a cohesive voice. Each school may have had their own particular bit of information, but it didn't talk with each other. And that was challenging. I know for the advisors, it was definitely challenging, instructors and students also. It was not a one-stop shop for all that information. And 2016, Student Information System put it all together. Let's go to the next slide. So the campus history. So the SIS project really put all this information together. It gave a collective idea of standardizing that, all those different systems, putting it together, identifying what was important, and stitching those things to make a more cohesive vantage point of financial aid, student records, etc. some of the departments still maintain their shadow systems, and this was out of need in certain way, that there was still information that didn't wasn't cohesively being brought into the SIS system, and there were still answers that needed to be asked, or there still need to be questions that need to be asked internally around some of these things. And then there was also some of the tools didn't necessarily answer some of the day-to-day questions that folks had, and advising was definitely one of those. If we can go to the next slide. The Learning Record Store is, as Stephen talked about, Canvas or bCourses. It's that there is a lot of information being generated in bCourses, whether it's grades, assignments, syllabi, how well a student is doing in their classes, that was maintained in Canvas but wasn't necessarily being ported over into the SIS service. It's a rich amount of information, and there is just tons of data points being managed within it. And there was wonderful opportunities there if you mined into it. There's a lot of questions that could be asked with those sorts of things. If we could go to the next slide. And so we saw some of the questions. So we saw this wonderful opportunity of advisors. Here is a large group of folks that needed specific points of information that was part of it was being brought up through the Learning Record Store, through SIS, but also their independent services that they also maintain. It's a cohesive group, but it's not necessarily a homogeneous group at that time. They needed to get access to student information that may be in other departments. If a student is thinking about choosing another major or a different, going to a different school, they didn't necessarily have the records that may be available in those certain schools. It didn't have a homogeneous centralized area for that. People were still working on paper records, or they didn't have access to a particular FileMaker Pro database. So you have roughly around 600 people that we identified who would benefit of having a centralized system around this. All of those 600 people, though, as mentioned in bullet point number 3, they all had FERPA, so they would be able to have access to all of them. Next slide, Stephen. So we look at advisors and kind of how changing and adaptive, and we use this word flexibility, and per conversation earlier, is having a wider understanding of campus, of how it works and operates, and that the role of an advisor is incredibly large. The questions that they have impact the rest of advising as well. In talking with advisors, we would understand that students would hop from one place to the next. They would ask their questions, but those questions never really ported over to the advisors who may also be working with them, whether it's a major advisor, a department advisor, school advisor, and certainly if they went outside. But there's this idea that really Berkeley advisors really are the in some ways the biggest assistance for students in kind of getting forward in their academic career. Next slide, please. So we started off with a very, PDO started off with a very small pilot, and this is working with the Athletic Studies Center and Derek Van Reen, of having 20 advising staff for their group of about 900 students. These were student athletes focused. They have a FileMaker Pro database that they were using to collectively maintain some of their systems. But how can we tie in some of the information that's part of the SIS, but also just the student record with their own particular database? And so we worked with them on figuring out what their needs were. They had very specific questions that weren't being answered at the time. Their FileMaker Pro database didn't have quite all the information, and we wanted to answer some of those things. And so working with them collectively and figuring out what their needs were without necessarily determining what the solution was with what software we had, but also working with our developers and figuring out how we could kind of collectively put this. And so this was the genesis of where Boa came about, is answering questions that they had. And so part of that was real-time academic process. They didn't have that. Trying to figure out some of these questions of how well a student is doing right now. And then trying to figure that out and working with cohorts and groups. Currently, that didn't exist at the time. You didn't have a cohort or group. So if they're working with their with a basketball team, how well is that basketball team doing? How well are they working with each other? How well collectively are they doing in their classes? And for those advisors in the Athletic Studies Center, they have like a cadre, the cohort of basketball or volleyball or whatnot. And they could see how well their group was doing collectively, but also individually. So yes, here's some more information. Derek Van Arenen, who we worked collaboratively with, who is a fantastic partner. It was a wonderful relationship. Again, working in this iterative agile process, we were able to answer some of these questions very quickly. We created a product, they were able to use it, and they said, okay, this works out really well. However, I would also like to see this. They were instrumental in being part of that design development process because they had a huge investment in it for themselves. They were not only just a partner for information, but also that collaborative partner in seeing success and going through this. Next slide, please. We reached out to the College of Engineering, and they're still our relationship partner in developing our services with them for Boa. But in doing so, we heard different questions and different needs with them. Here, the LRS, the learning data, to start improving some of that. So when we started talking with them, we had this basis of knowledge that we worked with the Athletic Studies Center, but we started building more and more. As we worked with more advisors, we heard more questions that they had. And being able to continue to grow what we have, not only for them, for the very specific answers that they have, but also thinking about what does this look like for the campus-wide advising community in general. And so we improved the, if you go back to the first slide there, or the slide previously, how can we make a much more richer dashboard for those advisors? Looking at some of the alerts, being able to answer the question of how well is the student doing in week 2, in week 3? Have they been going to their classes? Have they been doing the assignments? Well, we can take a look at that information. We can take a look at some of the questions around the academic outcomes that they may have. And we've also been able to take some of their database information and take it into Boa as a warehouse of information. Now you can go to the next slide, Stephen. So we've got 8 advisors, very hands-on, and in 3,300 students, which is phenomenal. And as you can see, these numbers keep getting bigger and bigger. 900 students at the time seemed like a lot. 3,300 students seemed like much more. And it keeps getting bigger. You can go to the next slide. So we started working with, and hold our breath when we got letters in science. This was a phenomenal amount of people. It seemed scary to us and just kind of keep open this. We were also thinking about performance issues. You know, what happens when you have more and more advisors? What happens when you have more and more students? And it's not just students who are here as of today. It is looking at archival and historic, because students come back sometimes, or you need to look at information on what had happened before. We started increased the transactional part of this. Notes became integrated within Boa. That was a huge pivot for us. Previously, it was just displaying information. Now it's looking about how you can integrate notes and how you share notes with other advising departments and other groups. That hadn't been done before. Beehive was an amazing bit of software for LNS, but it wasn't shared with other groups. And now it is. And it's exciting. It's exciting to see it. Stephen has some data on that, but it keeps increasing. Certainly now, as we're all living in different areas, the need for sharing that information online is imperative. Looking at data that has never been provided to LNS, we've been able to kind of, again, hook back into that learning record store of Canvas and really being able to show how well the students are doing now, how often they're going to their classes, compared to other students in those courses. I think Stephen will probably show a little bit of that in a bit too. We haven't been able to do comparative with how students are doing in other groups. And then it's just the continuation of looking at what those questions are and looking at some of that campus data strategy that's going on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we are, 150 advisors. It keeps broadening up and almost 22,000 students. It's incredible, and the feedback just keeps building upon it, and it keeps answering the questions of what's important, what areas do we need to focus on, what are the certain features that we could provide with this newfound area of information that didn't exist before. And I think that starts sparking off some of the questions that are being asked by advisors of like, well, we didn't have this before. Now that we look at it, you do have access to this information. Wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And this is where it becomes fun. This is where it becomes much more of a richer conversation of, I've always had this question and it seems like you've got that information. Can you answer that for me? Can you figure out if my hypothesis is correct? And being able to play those what ifs and being able to see how well they implement. And the nice thing about doing this Agile methodology is that we can probably answer those questions fairly rapidly. Next slide. And then partnering with CE3. Their questions are very specific onto a population and demographic that hasn't been answered before in other capacities. It's exciting to work with them and try to figure out how we can manage to get together this information with the body of work and the data that we've been having. And this is kind of exciting of an area. We're still working with them collectively and collaboratively to try to get to answer some of these questions. A lot of it is, and part of this is so it's the secure platform that we have, but it's also a lot of the analytics, but also making sure that we, I'm losing the thing that I had though is not the analytics part of it, but there's an assessment that needs to happen behind all of it as well. Stephen, next slide. Awesome. Stephen's going to do a Boa demo for us, which really does show the meat and potatoes of what we're doing.
Yeah, I will briefly stop the screen share so I can switch to the demo and not the slides. Thought I could do that all at once, but Zoom had other plans for me.
I like that we're still kind of apologizing for being on mute and things like that. Months later, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. I love it still.
All right, so you're all seeing my Boa homepage. Looking for nods. I see a thumbs up. Thank you, Flint. So for some of you, this may be a very familiar site. This is my Boa homepage. I'll start by saying I'm in demo mode today. So we are looking at real records, but they are all blurred for confidentiality because, of course, these records are sometimes very confidential. So this is sort of what it looks like because I'm actively using Boa. And so let's sort of start from scratch though, and talk about a little bit about what advisors see in Boa. What we've really tried to do in terms of the scale of BOA is that Flint was mentioning, is we had more and more students in the system, more and more records in the system. In fact, today we have all 30,000 plus undergraduates. And we also have records in BOA for the 300,000 or more undergraduates who have been enrolled at Berkeley since the time that we essentially began electronic record keeping about 20 years ago. So everything I'm going to do today is in real time. And so I would start by saying just sort of keep that in mind, because this is a live demo. This is the product as it exists. And for those of you who work with databases and know the challenges of scale and all of that, we're very proud of what has been accomplished and what our development team has accomplished here. Because, historically, if you were an advisor, you were going to work with records sort of one at a time. So if you wanted to keep up on a student, you wanted to monitor a student, you would go into a search box here, type in their name. I won't type in a name right now, just again, confidentiality purposes, but BOA would let you do it in that pretty simple way. Put in a name, put in an SID, and look up a single student. But that's not really reflective of the scale at which we learned our advising community works. We know that most of our advisors have a caseload in the hundreds. I think some cases, I don't think anyone's in the thousands, although there may be exceptions to that. But so as Flint sort of showed in the history of BOA, this was something that we really learned right away, was that advisors needed to be able to look at their students, not just as individuals, but to really be able to look at their students collectively. And so one way that we've accomplished that in BOA is with these tools that you see called Cohorts and Curated Groups. The cohorts are data-driven ways for advisors to find the students that they are most interested in supporting. So you can see here a variety of data points, and these can be used in really any combination to help advisors understand which of their students, all of their students at once, or maybe just some of their students. There is this My Students option here. This doesn't work for me because I'm not an advisor, but this for some advisors is the easiest way to get started, because this is any student who's assigned to you in SIS as your advisor. You can select this, generate the cohort. Data is real time, not quite real time, nightly, but these refresh on a day-to-day basis. So a student may be your student one day and no longer your student the next. And if you're capturing them through a cohort, then BOA will automatically reflect that. I think the most common scenario we use here is majors. So I'll just pick a major from this list. Let's pull up the math majors. So I'm just going to run a really quick query in BOA to create this cohort. So I've selected just a single filter here. I'll apply it. And you can see in real time, I found the 611 currently declared math majors. You may see today as we go through, there's a few students who've graduated, there's a few students who aren't enrolled. We have some work planned next year to better exclude those students from the cohorts than BOA does today. So just acknowledging that if you see as I scroll through. So at a glance as an advisor, I can see all of my advisees and I can get the information about them right up front that we've learned from advisors is of the greatest interest to them. And it really is about how has the student performed historically, how is the student performing today? And so you can see here, we've created sort of a graph of the student's GPA history to give you an understanding of, is this a student who's had pretty steady performance, or is this a student who's been a little more up and down? Give you a sense of their current unit load as well as their total units to understand their progress towards graduation, their current enrollments. I'm going to skip and just the grading option we learned from engineering is really important. The difference between an elective pass, no pass that maybe a student should not always pick versus the required pass, no pass. And then we've also got the bCourses activity here. And this is sort of a new data point that BOA provided when it launched on campus last year. Advisors historically always knew what grades did my students get last term, what grades, maybe midpoint deficient grades if an instructor posted those, but advisors couldn't at a glance get a sense of how their students were engaging in their current enrollments. And so what we've done with bCourses, with the Canvas data here, is really just picked the metric that we have the most confidence is associated with student outcomes, and that is sort of the level of persistence or engagement. And this is a really more important metric than ever now, of course. When we're on campus in the more traditional way, There's some courses that just don't really use bCourses, and so you may see pretty infrequent activity, and that's okay, that's normal. But right now, we feel pretty confident that most students in most courses should be looking at bCourses all the time. So as an advisor, you can see that right away. I can save this cohort, call it my math majors, and you can see that filled up over here on the left. If I refresh the page, it'll sort alphabetically instead of just at the end of the list. And so you can see that now as an advisor at a glance, I have this right in front of me. So if I'm the math advisor, I can come in, open that cohort, and check out my students at any time. You can use multiple data points as well. So there's also things that you can use. There's sometimes we have these unexpected real-time issues that come up. So over the summer, we weren't really sure what was going to happen legally with international students' ability to retain student visas during remote instruction. And so Boa became a really critical tool for that because our partnership, we have partnerships beyond the ones Flint outlined. One is with the Berkeley International Office. And we worked with them to make the student visa data readily available in Boa. So if I were the math advisor and I had an urgent need to understand which of my students might have new requirements to maintain their student visa, I can run that search in Boa very quickly. I can identify, this one will take a second longer, you can see. So a pretty good chunk of the math majors, about a third of them have some sort of visa. So I can save this. And then I can work with this cohort a little bit. So Boa isn't a tool for advisors. It's not a communications platform, but we knew that advisors sometimes wanted to communicate with students based on the criteria that are described here. So we have this export list functionality here that lets you just build a Excel CSV spreadsheet using the criteria that you're most interested in. We've pre-selected just the basic demographic contact info. But we've also added some other options here to make Boa sort of a powerful reporting tool for advisors who want to just be able to really quickly generate a list of their advisees. You can also use these cohorts for sort of monitoring real-time things that you might not necessarily know about on your own. So one thing I suggest to major advisors is that they can just keep a standing cohort. Again, I'll use math, which is a pretty good size. Math majors with a midpoint deficient grade, and this is just in the current term. And so, of course, if I had created this cohort a few weeks ago, it would have had 0 students, but as the midpoint deficient grades have posted, now there's 19 students who, as an advisor, I may want to pay some attention to. And this is something that's really powerful because the fact that these cohorts are so data-driven means that as an advisor, you don't have to necessarily think about which of the students you know might be at risk. You know, I'm going to scroll through the list here, and I see a lot of students here who've earned a midpoint deficient grade in the current term who, you know, this student has a 4.0 overall. And so as an advisor, this may not be a student that I'm actively thinking to monitor their academic progress to keep up on their grades. But with Boa, you can keep this cohort. It'll be 0 for the first half of the term, and then you'll see that number over here on the side suddenly, you know, would have jumped up from 0 to 19 if I'd had this cohort already in place. When the new term starts, it'll be back to 0, and then again at mid-spring, it'll start to fill up with students with a midpoint deficient grade. I won't keep building them, but just to show you the data again, this again reflects our partnerships with a lot of different departments. And so you can use Boa to do things like identify students with high grades. If you have a scholarship opportunity, perhaps, you know, female math majors with GPAs above 3.5 who may be eligible for some certain programming. I could build that cohort using multiple criteria here, using major, using gender, using GPA cumulative, and then just run that report in real time, have it available as an advisor, and then be able to work with it however I see fit. So in addition to the sort of data here, we've talked a lot about the SIS data, which is enrollments, final grades, midpoint grades. But then there's also the Canvas data layer, which is new to the campus with the release of Boa. And this is sort of the piece that I think makes Boa a little bit more than just having built a better beehive, essentially. Because as I mentioned, with the scale at which advisors work, it is difficult if you have 300 advisees to sort of keep track of which ones might be in the most need of attention. But BOA has what you can see over here are called alerts. And so these are a few items that we believe from our research, from our peer institutions research, are really correlated with outcomes that may be negative for students in their academic progress. So if I toggle this arrow menu here, again, everything's blurred, but I can see a list of my students who have alerts in the current term. And so it's sorted by who might need the most attention, who has the most alerts. And so I'll click through to a couple of these. This is a live demo again, so I know roughly what I'll find, but we'll see exactly what I find as I get in, why these alerts got generated. And so in this case, here's a student who has 2 alerts because they're not looking at bCourses as often as their peers. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that with these bCourses driven alerts, what we're doing is we're setting kind of a relative median or average for each course in bCourses. There's some classes that students may just not need to look at bCourses that much, and that's really true when we're teaching on campus. Some instructors create a site, say, I'm going to put the syllabus there and nothing else ever. And so we don't want to alert advisors that a student isn't looking at a course if their peers aren't looking at the course. But so in this case, I see there's 2 courses the student isn't that engaged with. I can maybe use my knowledge of the campus and of instruction to know that maybe a phys ed course doesn't need as much bCourses activity. But perhaps Anthro 150 would be a course that I would expect the student would look at a lot. So as an advisor, I can scroll down here to get a better understanding of the context of this student's engagement in bCourses and then how it compares to their peers. And so I can see here in this class, we've got, I can see the top of the list is the student, the context in which I got through to this course. And then I can scroll down here and say, okay, BOA alerted me the student hasn't looked at the site in 30 days. And I'm just going to do a quick reality check about this and scroll through the list. And, as an advisor, you're entitled to see all of these students, regardless of whether they're your advisee or not. So I can see that 30 days really is genuinely an outlier here. And that's why BOA generated the alert, is because pretty much every student in the course looked at the site as recently as yesterday, a few of them a little bit longer, but this student is really deviating from their classmates. And so in the, or if I wanted to reach out to the student, I could do so. And as an advisor, you'd have this evidence. We've also given some data about grades here, and I want to really emphasize we haven't opened a window into bCourses for advisors. We've been really thoughtful about presenting the data in a very student-centered way. So you're not getting individual assignment grades, you're not getting feedback or detailed, confidential communication between a student and their instructor. What you're really getting here is the student-centered metrics. When did the student look at the site last? How are they performing compared to their peers? And so again, in this case, I see the student has a 0. There's only been 1 assignment in this course, but the student didn't do it. And not only have most of their classmates submitted it, it's been graded. So if this were my advisee, I might want to sort of follow up with them and get an understanding of how their progress is looking in this course. I have another alert example here that just uses the SIS data, letting me know as an advisor that the student's no longer enrolled. We know the academic advisors often know about this before BOA knows about it, but because BOA serves groups like CE3 that maybe aren't the ones processing the paperwork when a student withdraws from the university, these alerts can really add value for those types of advisors. I'll open one more example here. I did peek at this earlier, and I just wanted to pull one up. Yeah, so just one more example here of a student who hasn't been that engaged with bCourses. In this case, they're enrolled in 3 courses this term, and they're not looking at any of these sites. And so although the student didn't earn any midpoint efficient grades, I also see there's a hold. And so because the student remains enrolled in the current term, but doesn't appear to be that engaged, they might benefit from some sort of outreach. I mentioned earlier the descriptive versus predictive analytics distinction, and I kind of want to circle back to that here. We've been really thoughtful for a lot of reasons, one of which is that predictive tools can often introduce bias. Companies can build models guessing what people might do next based on their past behavior. But these tools, when they're not created in a really thoughtful way, can reinforce bias rather than sort of overcome the bias. And so what we're doing here, the descriptive analytics piece is really critical because we're not saying necessarily what's going to happen as a result of the student's, what the student is or is not doing in the current term. What we are doing is we're really highlighting and putting that information in front of the advising community and drawing on really the wealth of knowledge and experience that the advisors themselves have and letting them apply their knowledge and their subject matter expertise in advising to sort of understand and their relationships with individual students to really create the context that we're not really confident that any electronic system might be able to do very successfully on its own. So those are the cohorts. I'll just briefly mention we've also got this tool called Curated Groups here. This is just a way for advisors to manually build a list of students. We know that there's times where there's certain things that may never exist in the campus data that's available to the cohorts. So you can kind of see examples here: prospective majors, workshop attendees. This would allow me as an advisor to sort of take a list of students that I had generated myself and then apply kind of the ability of BOA to look at these students as a cluster, as a group in this list view, because the cohort wouldn't capture it. We just recently also added the ability to kind of let these work together. So I could actually say, how many of my workshop attendees were women? So I can use this curated group that I created. I can use the gender filter. And again, just running this report very quickly and being able to understand that in this case, 140 out of this 210 student group that I had created. So this is a way that advisors can themselves really synthesize the campus data that we can refresh in an automated way with their own manual data sets that may not necessarily ever be found in a tool like SIS or a tool like Canvas. For this audience also, because I think this is a group that's interested in data and assessment, I just wanted to take a minute to show some of the features available to advisors on looking at the Canvas bCourses data in more depth. And I'll acknowledge, I think we're finding advisors don't use these tools so much today, but we're thinking about how to add value with these tools in the future. But we've created what's a pretty powerful set of visualizations and tools for advisors to work with. We saw a page like this before when we were looking at the student who had an alert for not looking at their course. But I just wanted to go into a little more depth on this, and this is a course with a little bit more activity, so we can actually see some of these visualizations appear. For each site, we create a box plot in BOA, so when you look up a course, so that you can understand what constitutes kind of normal student performance. And so the bounds of the box plot are the 30th to 70th percentile. So you can see in this case, the student is sort of a higher achiever. They're a little bit beyond the upper boundary of that box plot. I can scroll down here and see a student who's not doing so well. And perhaps not coincidentally, this student has only turned in 2 out of the 9 assignments. They haven't been that engaged with the bCourses site. So, this is the context of looking at a course. And so I think advisors are often starting with their cohort, starting with groups. They're looking at their work in a more student-centered way rather than a more course-centered way. But we've got a couple pockets of groups on the campus who are really interested in this more sort of course-level reporting. We've also got a pretty powerful visualization tool here in BOA that allows advisors and other BOA users to customize, to really visualize student performance and to explore or examine possible correlations between different data points in a course. And so in this case, we've got this this is the median student here. It's blurred, but it's just average student. But you can see here, I've set sort of 2 axes of assignment grades at the course level, and then cumulative GPA, which is sort of the student's historical performance. There's a lot of students missing from this box plot. I picked a course that a lot of first-year students take. They don't have a cumulative GPA, so you can see here a long list of students who are excluded when I use these criteria. But I can also just use Canvas-only criteria, and again, the days since the bCourses site viewed and the assignment grades. Now you can see what we're finding here is we're not always finding very strong correlations, and we were interested in whether we would, and I would say, at least in this example, this is probably an example of not finding that, where the frequency with which a student is looking at their bCourses site and their performance, we can't very effectively draw a line through here. But we can understand, again, what the median performance is, and then these sort of color-coded quadrants of, you know, above average in both, above average in one in the yellow, or below average in both. And again, as an advisor, if you're working with this, you know, this student's probably doing okay, they're below average, they're in the yellow quadrant, but they're so close to the median. You know, these students over here are outliers in a way that might benefit from intervention. These students up here are outliers in a way that they've been pretty successful on their own. One last thing I'll show, I'll just miss this warning that I'm in the demo environment, or just actually two more things, sorry. One more thing with the cohorts I wanted to show was some of the history tracking that the cohorts offer. And this is a feature we just rolled out over the summer. So some of you who work with Boa may not realize this is here. But we have this cohort history tool, actually it's the Econ one. So I mentioned the cohorts are data driven, they refresh nightly. But you only really, as an advisor, get a snapshot of who's in that cohort today. And currently today, this is a demo environment, so there's a discrepancy between these two numbers, but 1423 or 1422 students. But how has that changed over time? So the moment you create a cohort, Boa begins generating a history of who is in that cohort. And in this case, this is just happening due to, you know, students are declaring the major, students are changing majors, or students complete their program. So I can just click on a couple examples of who's been removed, and I think we'll see either, yeah, so in this case, they're in that sort of interim period where they've completed their degree but haven't yet had the degree awarded. So they'll fall out of the cohort once the degree is awarded. But you could also see that the major had changed. Yeah, so in this case, this is a student who fell out of the econ major cohort because they changed their major to a double major in math and data science. So, you know, again, if you're a major advisor, you probably have a pretty good sense of who's coming and going if you're just using that criteria. But because the cohorts are multi-criteria, it can be useful for things like, you know, if you wanted to track your advisees with a GPA in a certain range, you could see, you know, that would of course only change a couple times a year as the GPAs get updated. You could track of who, you know, if it was a high achieving cohort, you could figure out really quickly who was newly high achieving, who was no longer high achieving, or vice versa. If it was sort of a risk-based cohort, you know, perhaps students with a GPA range that wasn't quite at academic probation level, but was inching towards it, you could get a sense of students coming and going from that cohort. Also briefly show the the advising note capabilities that Boa introduced. Just pick a student at random. And so you can see here that Boa contains the advising notes for students. It's a little bit hard to sort of see this because we are keeping things confidential, of course, but I can just at a glance as an advisor see the notes that have been entered by my colleagues throughout the university. The advising notes are a shared resource for all advisors. So if a note is entered in Boa, it's visible to everyone who's authorized to see it in Boa, which is the academic, the college and major advisors. If I want to create a new note for the student, I just click this pop-up, put in a subject, details, and topics. We'd like to clean up this topic list, but this is a pretty comprehensive list of topics you can choose from. Add files and save that note, and it's there right away. But we built a couple enhancements for advisors as well. One is the ability to do note templates. So this could be something where if you find yourself writing the same note over and over again, I can just say major advising workshop, the student attended the workshop, I can save that note and it's done. So I've gotten that note posted very quickly because it's the same note I'm going to write over and over. We watched a lot of advisors with Google Docs open or Microsoft Word open, copying and pasting. So we just built that right into Boa to let advisors do it themselves. Discard that note and then also show down here. So there's two places to create a note. The student context is just for the one student. But if you create a note from the left sidebar over here, you can actually post a note to multiple students all at once. So this would be, let's say I wanted to log my 229 workshop attendees. So I've already created that group. I can get a warning up here that it's going to be added to 229 student records, major advising workshop, and I can save that note, and BOA will post a note to 229 students right away. I see the grade scope question I'll come back to, and the question that just came in. The templates right now are siloed to individual advisors, but we would like to share them. It is a one-time thing though, where you just set up the template and then you have access to it as an individual advisor. Shareable templates are interesting, and I think for the obvious reasons of just, you know, shared efforts on people not needing to rebuild the same template. And the grade scope question earlier. So somebody asked about, is the grade scope behavior captured in BOA? And the answer is not quite yet, but they're actually one of the vendors that has been, I think, the most engaged with us on seeing the value of data, wanting to get us the data. And we're actually pretty far along in bringing that data into what we call our data lake, where all of this stuff is captured. So we're hoping to make that data more visible in the future in BOA. So I'm going to wrap up the demo and just pivot back to a few sort of final thoughts, more than a few, but so let's get this open. And as Flint said, yes, we are still apologizing for the technical challenges of running a meeting remotely. There we go. So just, you know, so since we launched BOA in summer 2019, over 88,000 advising notes have been created in BOA. And that's at this point pretty much equivalent to the number of notes that were authored in the CalCentral tool over a period of years. Now, of course, BOA doesn't get all the credit for this. The transition to remote instruction, remote everything, I think was a big driver of the increase in people entering electronic notes without access to their filing cabinets and other tools. But it is really a tool that's being used as part of the daily workflow for advisors, as some of you here are very familiar with. Are you seeing my screen? Are you seeing my slides?
We sure are.
Thank you, Flint. Sorry, I didn't see the usual note on my screen telling me that you were. And so, you know, as I showed with the note authoring, those batch notes are a real time savings. We talked to an advisor early on who was responsible for logging probation decisions, and she would allocate multiple days of work to enter those notes in CalCentral one at a time for hundreds of students who were newly on academic probation or had that status removed. And with BOA, she can take that list of SIDs, create a group, create a batch note, and it becomes about a 60-minute project instead of a multi-day project. And as I showed in the demo, we're really trying to support advisors at scale by identifying students at risk. A student who is not performing well currently, who has a history of who's maybe on probation today, you're going to be keeping an eye on them. But we saw at least one example in the demo of a student with a very high GPA who has an issue with a midpoint grade in the current term. We know from talking to advisors that students like that sometimes slip through the cracks historically. And so BOA really helps bring that data to the surface for advisors because we know it's really relevant to you all in your work. Part of why BOA is more than just a better beehive is also because of its alignment with some of the campus IT outcomes and priorities. Last fiscal year, academic year, we had really two key priorities that described BOA. The first was just the enhanced advising tools. But there's also a piece with BOA where we've built what we'll call a data lake in BOA to sort of capture all this data from all these different tools that didn't historically talk to each other and merge it all together into the format that's required for a tool like BOA to present it to advisors. This is something that campus IT really sees as an important strategic priority. And in fact, the data lake sort of ownership and stewardship is now shared between research, teaching, and learning, and then the campus enterprise data and analytics team, who are historically responsible for these large data sets. Boa is a layered project too, and so that's with the data lake. Just thinking of, this is the foundation that everything's built on top of, is bringing together all these different systems. But we've also got the Canvas data, and this is sort of not as much of a clear boundary as it looks here. At this point, the Canvas data pretty much is the data lake, but just calling that out. And then we've got up here, the top layers are Boa, and then a tool that's just a developer tool called Nessie that kind of is used to pass all the data lake data through into Boa for advisors to use. But keeping in mind that Boa is just the very top layer of this project, the campus is really beginning to think about what else could a data lake provide, and what else could we add to the data lake to make it more valuable and make it more beneficial for the campus and for the users that we serve. This isn't a technical presentation, but any of you who are sort of more technically minded, I just have this slide I'll keep up briefly, sort of showing the data flow from the data lake. Even for the non-technical folks here, just this helps sort of visualize all the different sources that we have to bring together. We're currently using the Amazon Web Services tool to aggregate this data together and then process it into sort of a database format that can be used by Boa users in real time. Our work is open source. So we all the code that drives Boa is anyone in the world can look at it and can explore replicating it on their own campus. And this is sort of a principle that we really stand behind, where we feel like, especially with analytics that can be a little bit mysterious, be a little bit shadowy, it's really important that we are approaching this in a spirit of transparency and in a spirit of really helping people kind of see what we do, how we do it, why we do it the way we do. And so it's more than just reuse the code on your campus. It really is this broader principle of let's demystify the analytics. Let's not have a black box that's making decisions about people's future. So what's next for Boa, the tool itself? One of my big projects for 2021 is going to be a deeper analysis than we've done so far about the reliability of these alerts and specifically how they correlate with student outcomes. From our research, from peer institution research, we've got a pretty good degree of confidence that, when students are not engaged with their electronic materials and bCourses, that they don't do as well in their courses. But how strong is that correlation? We just work on sort of the Boa backend to enhance our ability to capture and log these alerts. And so beginning with data from fall 2020, which will have more data than ever about students' use of bCourses, we'll be able to really take a look at the alerts and keep refining them. We can tell the advisors today that we're pretty sure the alerts correlate with outcomes, but we'll be able to put, I think, a finer point on that sometime next calendar year, and then fine tune our modeling around what generates an alert to associate it with things that we learn have stronger correlations. The Boa team, the PDO team, is currently engaged with College of Engineering. They've actually hired us, contracted with us to build some student progress tracking tools on top of Boa. Currently, that's functionality that's for COE only, but we're exploring how it can be applied to other groups on campus, because we know there are some pretty big unmet needs around tracking student progress. We're also kind of working with both Canvas and then campus IT partners to really think about how can we make the data lake even broader and deeper than it is today. So there was the question about Gradescope earlier. We're looking at bringing in data from Gradescope. We actually now have an agreement with Piazza as well that those of you who are familiar with it, it's a discussion board tool that's pretty popular on campus, where we're going to begin getting those data streams connected to the data lake and then be able to just have even richer data than we do today about student engagement and student grades. There's also areas of Canvas that we know could be better. There's an attendance tool in Canvas that doesn't work very well at the scale of a school like Berkeley, but we would like it to, because we think if we had a tool where instructors wanted to track student attendance and participation, then how great would that be to put in front of advisors? And really, again, to improve our ability to generate alerts and not just did they look at bCourses, which doesn't really tell us anything of substance about what they did, and look instead at, does the instructor think that they're engaged and participating? I just wanted to mention a few other analytics projects at peer institutions as well that sort of are a different take on data than what we're doing at Berkeley, but I think that folks in this group might be particularly interested in some of the good work that's happening at other large sort of R1 peer institutions. Indiana University has generated an app called Boost that they built that is similar to Boa in terms of what it looks at. So it's submitting assignments on time and meeting deadlines and getting work in to get a good grade. And so this is a really powerful tool that's an opt-in tool that instructors and students can choose to use, where students essentially get a notification on their computer or their phone saying, you have a deadline coming up, you haven't turned in your work yet, don't forget. There's a couple risks and limitations around this tool, and they're not barriers to us doing it at Berkeley, but there's some risks around student stress that the research supports with nudging tools. A lot of times students who aren't performing well already know they're not performing well. Some students are really benefited by these reminders, and some students maybe the intervention behaviorally of getting that nudge can really help the student keep on track, keep on time. Other students may be overwhelmed by it, and it may just sort of complicate matters for them further. There's also mixed results on whether nudging really results in behavioral change. I don't think anyone thinks it's a bad thing, but the range of outcomes of nudging range from it doesn't do anything to it has a positive effect. But we're not seeing the super strong correlation. So this isn't an area that Berkeley's exploring too much today, but it's really impressive work. There's also University of Michigan has a tool called Student Explorer that's very similar to Boa, although it's much more narrowly focused on just the data that's generated in Canvas there. So they haven't synthesized it with all the other sources that Boa does. It's not a note-keeping tool the way that Boa is. So it doesn't give the opportunities for advisors to apply their expertise. It doesn't really allow the more advanced reporting about different kinds of demographics and how those correlate with outcomes. The one thing Michigan's done that's interesting is this very color-coded model that's a little simpler than the alerts. It is something where the understanding the reliability of the alerts may be a step for us to move towards a model here that is a little bit less for the advisors to sift through when they log into Boa. Is this color-coded green, yellow, red? How is the student doing? Michigan, because of their policies around data, advisors only see the green, yellow, red. But what Michigan's done that's really impressive is created this very, very transparent chart about the criteria that generate these alerts. So their campus isn't comfortable in the way that Berkeley is with telling a student, or excuse me, telling an advisor that a student looked at Canvas 10 versus 15 days ago. But what they are comfortable with is the color-coded alerts that, in their case, are just about grades and not about persistence or the engagement is over here. So they kind of merge those together. So, if a student has a great grade, they kind of ignore the participation. If a student's in the middle, they apply the participation and use these percentiles to sort them out. The downside of this approach is just it's not as rich in data, of course, as what we're putting in front of advisors with Boa. So we want to keep working on these predictive models. I think we have some opportunities to improve our predictive models when we look specifically at the semester in the cloud courses, which are very similarly structured and they're fully online. And we do have sort of a distinction today between online and remote. Remote means the instructor is doing the work themselves to put the materials online, versus online, which means that a team of instructional designers are using a template and building a course. So we're pretty sure that we would find some different and maybe more rich data when we look at the semester in the cloud portfolio that has about 30 courses this fall that all roughly use the same format, all have the content roughly structured the same way. So we expect there's going to be more similarity in terms of the patterns of student behavior and the correlations between different behavior and different outcomes. This is a ways off. We're not there yet, but it is something that's sort of on our mind as we think about how to use the data strategically. So just to wrap up, and then we can answer some questions, sort of aligned with the topics I raised at the beginning. Again, this descriptive versus predictive piece with analytics. What we are doing today is really descriptive analytics at Berkeley, but it's going to give us these opportunities for these things like improving our ability to, it's not full predictive analytics, but it's at least, what are the behaviors, what are the outcomes, what are the correlations, and what is most relevant for advisors and for in supporting students with making normal academic progress. We wouldn't be able to do this without our partners. This is a story of partnership more than anything else. Both the ASC, College of Engineering, Letters and Science, who really helped us shape some of the foundational decisions, and then our continued engagement with partners, both in the advising community as well as in IT, just to really strengthen what we're doing with BOA and to make it more central to the day-to-day work of a number of groups. BOA has a ton of data, and sometimes it's even more data than we know what to do with, the billions of data points. We could be doing different things with the data, but right now we are really focused on some of these core functionalities and how to improve those. But we know we see peers doing things with data that's much more complex, and it's maybe sometimes more than we know what to do with. And then just we're meeting the transactional needs of advisors. I think for a lot of advisors, they see BOA first and foremost as a tool for creating advising notes, and that's great. We're glad to have a tool in the hands of advisors that really meets that need transactionally day to day that they have. But when or if those advisors are ready and interested in using it, we've added a lot more to BOA as well. They can look at the Canvas data, they can utilize the alerts that we're generating based on a number of sources. So I think BOA is a lot of things to a lot of people, and ultimately everyone who has access to BOA has access to most of these functionalities. I'll mention both in response to a question and just any possible future questions. BOA access is determined by CIS in terms of CIS access to advising tools. So if you have the ability to create advising notes or read advising notes in CalCentral today, you can log into BOA and do the same. Not everyone on campus has that ability by any means. It's limited to a subset of people on campus. And then we do have some staff with a lower level of advising permissions who can see the student data in BOA, but not the advising note data. So they can see the profile and the grades and all that, but they're not authorized for access to advising notes, which can sometimes have really confidential information for some students in particular. So I'm going to stop. I'll leave this up for a second. If anybody wants to email Flint or I, here I'll hand it over to folks to ask questions via audio or in the chat.
So Kelly had asked about bringing in data from other sources, and I think you answered that pretty well, Stephen. But in specific, there's like Salesforce and Zendesk, and I would say that there's definitely a need of that sometimes. One of the things that I've heard from advisors is students go to Cal Student Central, and I don't have that information, and I would like to know what that is. And Cal Student Central uses Salesforce. And if we have access and API connections and all that other kind of business, then it's definitely an area that we would like to connect with. I think that it does improve and enhance what the advising experience is through BOA. So yes, definitely. But it always depends upon what is the question that we're asking. You know, what are we trying to answer for, and kind of dipping into that more and more. There's always a need in trying to figure what that is.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that too. I mean, BOA is already doing a bit of this today. It's a bit of work for us to establish and maintain these connections to other databases. But one thing that's hard to show in the demo is that BOA actually contains advising notes that were previously completely invisible to most advisors on campus because they lived in a FileMaker database that's maintained by the Athletic Studies Center, and then the CE3 that Flint mentioned earlier uses essentially the same database. Those groups have only authorized us to bring over partial versions of those notes into BOA, but advisors now can see when their advisees may have an advising relationship with a non-academic advisor who historically never would have taken notes in the central campus system. Similarly, we've hooked up Boa to a College of Engineering departmental database that has some data points that are stored and captured there, but don't exist within SIS or other campus tools. So if you've got a system you're interested in us hooking up to, like I said, it's not always necessarily something that we can do quickly, but it is something, you know, I mentioned, I think in a slide, this idea of shadow systems, databases that departments may be really reliant on, but may not be aligned with sort of modern best practices with data security, data privacy, things like that. And so BOA really provides an infrastructure to support potentially decommissioning those kinds of tools to centralize the records as well as to improve the security and integrity of the records.
We have another question around, is it possible to see what courses students have enrolled in or waitlisted for the following semester once phase 1 starts? I believe that's true, yes?
Not quite yet. So
okay.
we have a couple little projects in the works on that. So yeah, I can go into detail because I think these will both be done in the next couple months. So we saw that list view earlier. So you create a cohort or group, you've got a list of the students, and BOA kind of only has this one term at a time idea right now. So you just see whatever the enrollments are and what BOA defines as the current term. We're going to improve that page to let advisors make a selection so that, especially this time of year where you're thinking both about fall 2020 and spring 2021, so that in that list view, you can toggle between both the current enrollments and then the next term enrollments, maybe the past term. We'll see how the implementation of this goes. We also right now, I think you're not going to see the spring enrollment data yet, and that's an issue that we're going to solve a little more quickly, where I think the spring enrollment data starts flowing into BOA in just about a week now, I think roughly mid-November, and we're going to close that gap for future terms. So I think this fall to spring transition will be the last time that there's that delay, and then in future terms, it'll essentially be as soon as the student registers, and of course, you'll see that enrollment in BOA the next day.
So there's a fantastic question. This goes back to the ideas that we carved out. BOA was specifically around advising, but we've created a whole system, this data lake that has a rich data set of information in the synthesization of that information. And can this be used for different things? And also the access of those different things, whether it's data scientists or any other sort of information. And the answer, I think, is yes. I mean, it does become, if it's not BOA specific, if you have this data lake, what can you do with it? How do you give access to whatever that might be?
And this is one of the principles behind what I alluded to earlier, which is that the data lake really started as the foundation of BOA, and it's actually now part of the enterprise data and analytics team's portfolio. This is a group that, in fact, has a little more experience than RTL, I think, through their work with Office of Planning and Analysis and other data-driven groups on campus to make those kind of decisions from a policy perspective around who can see which data. But the data lake as a tool to drive other campus products and platforms is sort of one of the long-term goals here, with BOA just being one of potentially many future applications of this data lake resource.
There's a question around blurring of information. This is actually this is just a feature in BOA, because we do give these demonstrations and we are very conscious around FERPA and presenting in the information, is that it's just a little checkbox and it uses CSS to blur out the specific areas. So we just want to make sure that when we develop new features into BOA, we need to be conscious of, will this blur out? If we're giving a demonstration, what areas need to be not presented in a complete form. So it's one of those really easy to implement kind of things on our side of the fence. I think one of the biggest issues that we run into is there's a lot of good ideas. Everyone that we've worked with, our relationship with people are, oh, you can do that? What about if you can do this sort of thing? And that's the biggest limitation, I think, is time and trying to implement all these things. And we do a really good job. It's a prioritization. A huge thanks to Stephen for being able to do that, of figuring out Is it something easy to implement? Is it time sensitive? Is it something that is a huge need right now, and trying to implement those things? In some cases, some of these things are easy enough to do, and because we work on that Agile methodology, is that we're able to actually sometimes turn around some of those features pretty effortlessly within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending upon what it is. And it's a nice touch. It's nice being able to work collaboratively with the customer, having that relationship, and being able to say, we talked about this at our last meeting, and now it's part of BOA.
I see Kelly has a question about outreach. Yeah, that's a great question. We have a number of standing engagements with different folks. I don't think Susan Hagstrom is here today, but many of you may know Susan. She's been on campus for a long time, and I think just in the last year or so, she began a new role as the manager of advising strategy and tools. And so Susan has really become such a critical part of the BOA team in the brief time that she's been in that role, because she does have such sort of a bird's eye view of the advising community, of the needs of that community. And she's doing a lot of work to coordinate different kinds of workshops and training and resources. And so she's been really, really key to our ability to do that. We certainly have done, especially when we launched BOA, there was a lot of direct outreach. I spent a lot of time on campus doing drop-in support and workshops and trainings and stuff, and really just casting a pretty wide net. Every academic advisor on campus had BOA access in August of last year, and so we gave them all the opportunity. I think probably a later stage for us is, we do know that there's pockets of deep and rich BOA use today. I think the College of Letters and Science in particular comprises maybe 2/3 of those 88,000 advising notes I mentioned earlier. And there's other departments that aren't using it much at all. We don't necessarily see that as a problem to be solved. We want people to use the tools that best meet their needs. But I think in the future, we would like to do some outreach in a really data-driven way to look at what's happening in BOA, look at who's not using it, and say, could we change this platform in a way that would make it work better for you? And if the answer is no, I like my filing cabinets and file folders, then we can say, okay, let us know if you want to transition over, and we'll help support you with that process. We think there's value, of course, in everyone having the shared advising notes. And so that's a piece that we think is a value add as well, is that we didn't necessarily, advisors immediately understood the benefits of being able to see the notes that their colleagues had entered. And so in that way, BOA the value made itself apparent to advisors the moment.
Well, wow, this is an amazing tool. I wish it had been around when I was an advisor. Let's give them a big round of applause using our applause reaction emoticons. Thank you, Flint and Stephen.
Thank you.
The slides and the recording will be sent out to the CAN listserv later this afternoon or on Monday. And I hope that this session has helped with your professional development and with your appreciation of assessment, and that you continue to engage with this staff organization and others while we're doing our shelter-in-place and remote work. They're an important piece of maintaining community on campus. If you have any further questions, hang out for a little bit. I think Flint and Stephen will be available for another couple minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording and wish you all a very happy weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katie.